I am pleased to welcome to the stage New York Times bestselling author and Fox News host, Mr. Brian Kilmeade.
As much as I enjoy the standing ovation, when you start with a standing ovation, you'd only go backwards. So that's what I worry. So I appreciate everybody being here tonight. I've never been invited to a book festival. So to be invited was great. To have a book ready to go was fantastic. And I'm so glad everything lined up to be here on a beautiful Saturday. And there's no Kentucky basketball scrimmage that's keeping all of you busy that would allow you to show up. But I think we have a few things in common. I don't care about politics. I think we all love the country. We also know where we come from has not been perfect. It's not been a straight line, but we always get better. We constantly get better. And as I tell you, say it time and time again, I think the thing that's great about our country is not that we're perfect and it's in my dedication, it's that we try to be. And we are our toughest critic, and that's why it sounds loud and noisy and uneven from the outside, but that's only because we're constantly getting better. And you don't become the #1 economic and military superpower and the envy of the world overnight. You do it constantly over the course of years and generations. And when I first started looking at the history books, I said, I've always had a passion for history. If I had some free time, that's the book I'm picking up, even when I was doing sports full time. And then when I realized that when I'm picking up our history, people in news are not rooted in our past and they have no idea that what's happening today is not the beginning and end, that you need a perspective to understand the hurdles we're clearing and the ones we're dealing with on a regular basis. But I never knew that history would be so part of the news. I thought to myself, I want to get on Hannity's show, but my history book on George Washington is not exactly like Trump running for office or George Bush in the Iraq War. I had no idea that so much in our past was going to come up in our news. Now, every one of these PowerPoints is a little different. I've never worked this control before, but Ethan, just go straight ahead. And if I make a mistake, you just hit that yellow button, that red button. Okay. So this is the book that's out for a few hours or a few days, The President and the Freedom Fighter. And I think the subtitle tells it all. #1, how dare Frederick Douglass have the same last name as Stephen Douglas? I couldn't put their last names in the title. So I thought that describes them both. Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, and their battle to save America's soul, to make us a more perfect union. To get the 13 states together, we got to make certain compromises. Then we had to beat the British. We did both. But it put off a problem that had to be dealt with. We thought would sunset the 1820s that went right through the 1860s. All throughout time, we had great people stand up and lead us, and sometimes for the most unlikely circumstances. Andrew Jackson, an orphan kid in the Midwest, this guy should have been a criminal. He ends up being a war hero, 2-term president, and dominate 50 years of American politics. You take Lincoln and Douglas, the way they started and where they ended up, you would never have predicted either one would be the people to save our country, but I would argue they did. But can I take a step back a little and talk about where I started at Fox? You guys been watching me at Fox? So does anyone remember I started at Fox as the sports guy? So I was the sports guy. Steve and I would do the weather before it was even Fox and Friends, and it was called Fox Express. So we would do the sports, or do the weather, then go sit in the green room. Then they would read the news. It was like headline news. And wasn't really going well. The anchors were doing their checkbook. They were so sick of doing the same news over and over again. I noticed there was no personality there. Steve and I would be kidding around. People in our ear would be wrap it up. And I go, wait a second. I think what we're doing is better than what they're doing. And we got a chance to talk. They would later shut down the teleprompter, make it more conversational, have news, but make it part of the story, make the talking points the story where we get a chance to use our personalities for better or for worse. Because maybe people don't want me to use my personality. So what happened is when you guys are into sports, right? A lot of you. Kids play sports. Well, to me, I wanted to be great. I wanted to be a great soccer player. In the 70s, not many people were playing soccer, and the Cosmos were out there, and I wanted to be a great player. And something happened along the way. Oh yeah, I remember. I wasn't. So I was an average Division II player. And I thought, wow, what an epic fail. I'm 21. I've been playing since I was 5, about 10 out of every 12 months, indoor, outdoor. What a waste of time. But I said, I'm going to be a sports guy. And with that, I worked really hard. Sports phone was the first, predated all sports radio. Sports phone was 976-1313. You do a sports update in 57 seconds, 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week, nonstop, no script. If people wonder why I talk a little fast, I'm forever afflicted with getting every sports score and story in 57 seconds. So what happened is when people come up and talk to the sports guy, they talk sports. I would turn it on them. So with Kevin Sorbo, I go, Kevin would talk sports. I go, what'd you play? Oh, I was going to be a great basketball player at University of Minnesota. I got hurt. My coach didn't like me. Oh, all right. Talk to Henry Kissinger. I go, why are you such a soccer fan? He goes, well, I used to play in Germany right before World War II. The Jewish kids used to play against the non-Jewish kids, and I was really good. And in fact, I had a chance to do something, but I had to get out of there because of what was happening in Germany. But I have a passion for that game ever since. Like, that's a pretty good story. And I thought, why did I play? Didn't do anything. Division II soccer player playing in front of 12 people. Why did Kissinger play? Why did The Rock play? He wanted to go pro. Rock wanted to go pro. All his friends at the University of Miami, they all went pro. He got cut in the CFL. He's living in his parents' basement, married, and said, what a loser I turned out to be. But it set him up for life because life is not easy. We all have goals. We want to get that house. We want to get that girl, that guy. We want to get that car. You want to get that job, and it doesn't happen. Sports, I would say, it is a slice of life, which brought me to these 2 books. The Games Do Count. I talked to 72 people, America's best and brightest in the power of sports. Not one of those people you would know as an athlete. From Condoleezza Rice, figure skating, to Jack Welch as a baseball player. He's the America's CEO. Yeah, I go, what happened with you? He goes, I was a great player in 9th grade. And then what happened? He goes, I never grew. So he ends up being a leader on the bench and got to know what it was like to be the so-called blue-collar worker. And George Bush 41, first base at Yale. His son ends up being a president. He said, I regret to this day, my dad was an excellent player. I had the same ability. I was so wilted under what he did in baseball at the same high school. I froze. I didn't end up playing well in pressure. I didn't go to those camps like my dad did before. And when I went to college, I played 1 year, but I just said to myself, I'm going to have to work twice as hard and here on in. And then I run to prove that it doesn't matter if you go pro, if you're Joe Montana or George Foreman, or if you're somebody in history like George Patton playing West Point football. He talked about, we found letters writing back to his future wife, 145-pound middle line or outside linebacker, can't break the lineup. He's writing letters. What's wrong with me? All I ever wanted to do was play on this football team. I finally break the lineup and I break my forearm. And I said to myself, wait, Mr. Blood and Guts plays the blood and guts game and can't get on the field. So it's not what you want. You go for it as hard as you can, and your glory is not denied, it is delayed. So I wrote those 2 books, felt pretty good about it. I have a lot of parents telling me it inspired their kids to keep playing, the average athlete, the pro athlete. And I thought, good, I'm finished, I'm done. But there's something about in that book, the people in history, that intrigued me. Reading about Patton, reading about Lincoln, reading about Reagan, how they wanted to be great athletes, but it helped them later on when they so-called failed. So at the same time, I'm working on this other idea. I've been studying George Washington's spies. I grew up on Long Island. Has anyone been to Long Island? All right. I grew up, went to Long Island University. I did not know that George Washington had a spy ring that lived and died without any fame and acclaim. Without them, they wouldn't have won the war, top secret till the 1930s. And as this was put together, in comes the Depression, World War II. I found a little blurb in the New York Times. Local historian makes major find. So I see this and I look at this for 20 years. And then Nicolas Cage comes out with that National Treasure. And I go, I have a better story. It really happened. And my lead actor could actually be understandable. He tends to mumble. I don't know if you noticed by Nicolas Cage. So it brought me to George Washington's Secret Six. And as I did it, there was a CIA and intelligence scandal, so I was able to equate that in the news. We have this thing called the War on Terror. Anytime anybody wanted to talk incomprehensively about Islamic extremism, they always go back to Jefferson. So I went to the Jefferson Library, And I looked there, and there's one guy in charge. He goes, nobody ever asked me in depth until recently about how he took on Islamic extremism. So I thought, Jefferson, that might get you to look at the book. And if I told you Islamic extremism, we live with it every day. But can I tell you what we did and how we prevailed? And Jefferson did so much on his resume, no one really talks about it. So I go, unplowed ground, like the spies, go do it. And people love the story. They can relate to Jefferson because he's fantastic. He belongs at every statue, not to be taken down, right? But what if I told you William Eaton? Probably don't know him. What if I talk about Presley O'Bannon? Probably don't know him. So the rest of the world turned away and said, we don't want to deal with these Islamic nations. We're just going to pay them money not to invade us, not to attack us. America stood up for itself, and they sent a group of people 500 miles through the desert and took Tripoli. We're about to take Tripoli before we cut an ill-advised peace deal. And I'll give you that rest of that story, which brought me to another era, the War of 1812, Andrew Jackson. Many people can relate to the fact you weren't connected in Virginia. Many people can relate to the fact that sometimes you're given horrible circumstances you grow up in. So I thought you could see Jackson become this leader and win a battle. Everybody told us they didn't have to fight. It's upon further review, he had to fight it. Without it, they probably would have taken, and the British probably would have stopped us from moving past the Mississippi, which would have been a little bit of a problem. And then that brought me to Texas. Anybody live from Texas? Good. I grew up, not that I'm happy about it, but everybody likes their region. You learn a lot about Kentucky history. I get it. I learned a lot about New York history. I understand it. Virginia. But in Texas, they have their own unique history, but it's our history. So I know everybody knows the Alamo, but I said, what happened after the Alamo? Nobody knows that outside Texas. So I go, unplowed ground. I want to tell that story. Which brings me to a quick look at these 4 books, these slices of American life. And on top of that, a lot of this stuff can be seen on Fox Nation, What Made America Great. We do specials now. The special on my latest book is 10 o'clock tomorrow night. But here's a quick look. If this button works, and I think it does, these 4 books come to life. Okay. Let's see if the backwards button works. You guys know? All right. I think this will work. No, it won't. Do we have the tape? Okay. So bring it to this while we wait. For people who say we didn't have to fight that war, this is what Thomas Jefferson said. Keep in mind, James Madison's president. The defense of New Orleans should teach the nations of Europe that while Americans intended to take no part in their wars, neither would this country shrink from self-defense. We would never be invaded again. So in case you think I'm overstating what was going on in the world at that time and what people thought about this upstart nation, the War of 1812 let them know we're not going anywhere. And then the Islamic war against those 4 Islamic extremist nations, Pope Pius VII said this: the Americans, with a small force, we literally built a navy in the middle of the war of 1805. The Americans, with a small force in a short space of time, have done more for the cause of Christianity than the most powerful nations of Christendom have done for ages. So when people walk around and go, America, like our former governor, we were never that great. Could someone tell Pope Pius VII, and I believe the other 6 Piuses would have agreed? Which brings me to the president and the freedom fighter. So why would I pick these 2 incredible men? Number one, I know Frederick Douglass got Book of the Year by David Blight 3 years ago. So I know people are aware. And I know this: Abraham Lincoln is the most written about president in our history, and I get it. But what if I talk to you about the most crucial time in our history? One man born in the Midwest to 2 illiterate parents in abject poverty, who loses his mom at the age of 9, who everyone describes as unseemly and gangly with terms we wouldn't use today because they're politically incorrect. a man that people had to pay attention to but couldn't get their eyes off of, and then later would be because of his mind and his intellect? And what if I told you another man was born a slave who really never knew his mom, and his dad ended up being one of his slave holders? What if I told you he didn't have clothes until he was 8 years old? What if I told you that he would be told that if he was to read and write, he'd be arrested and anyone who taught him would be jailed? He would manipulate his way to learn to read and write. He would see the value of education. He would read the same book as this guy named Abraham Lincoln, thousands of miles away from each other, called the Columbian Orator, that talked about George Washington, Plato, and Cicero, and these great minds and freedom and what society could be. That was Frederick Douglass. He had a thirst for learning. While we're all talking about education, what our schools could teach, he could not find a school. He would be sitting there watching the other white kids who were friendly with him because he was under the belief that kids don't see color as we are. Frederick Douglass, born a slave, his best friends growing up were white kids because the kids did not care. And Frederick Douglass in the 1840s writes, I think it'll take a generation to live and die before they realize there's no difference between the races. We'd have a few more to wait. But that is why we protest, as I digress, second and third graders, and why we care so much what they learn. Because they told us it matters. Abraham Lincoln, 1 year of formal schooling. 1 year, combined. He never could sit in a classroom. His dad says, I'm always suspicious of those people that learn to do the reading and writing. That's who he's up against. But he went to learn. He never stopped reading. He had that reputation of a great intellect, a great mind, great kindness, great strength. And then he said, I'm going to become a lawyer. Not a lot of political connections with Abraham Lincoln. He started running for office to become a one-term congressman. Nobody is looking at Lincoln to lead us to freedom to the most difficult time. For Frederick Douglass, he's got to escape for freedom. He's got to stand up to his slave master. He's got it once free. He could still be arrested for years later. 7 years after that, he writes his autobiography. Then he goes to Europe for 21 months. They still have statues with him and plaques in Ireland, Scotland, and London of what he did and what he said. And they saw the promise. He could have stayed there, sent for his family, going back, because I'm going to bring that message, because he wanted to be an American. And a man that was born into slavery, that was told the Constitution had to be destroyed, but the more he worked, the more he read, the more he realized the Constitution was the key to freedom. We weren't living up to it. We didn't have to tear it down. It was built to be, it was perfect. We just weren't living the perfect country that we actually, for the founders who drew it up. And I open up with the book with the introduction with Madison and Jefferson weighing in on what they saw as slavery, including Benjamin Franklin. They knew it was wrong. They couldn't get out of it. So I don't judge. We know it's wrong, but you can't put yourself in our time in 2021 and say, I know exactly what life was like in 1750. We used to understand that. We knew that it was imbued in us. We knew that. We can't tell people. You ever talk to people, you talk to your great-grandparents or your grandparents, some of the things they say is so unpolitically correct, you wonder why they thought it. Then you found out in 1940 and 1950, turns out it was a different generation. They're not bad. Later, people are going to look at us in 2021 and say, what were they thinking? Actually, we're saying that today, driving over, listening to the radio, watching TV, but I digress. So to see both these men get on parallel paths and then finally meet, when he's doing the research, it started 2 years and 2 months ago, and when they finally meet, and the person who wrote it down verbatim was Frederick Douglass. Lincoln sadly didn't have the time to do it. I would love to have read his book. He waits online. He gets online outside the White House. He's there for 2 minutes. He expects to be there for 2 days. As soon as his card goes forward, Lincoln sends for him. And he walks past sitting senators, congressmen, rich people, poor people, and he gets right into his office. And he was very critical of Lincoln because he didn't move fast enough on a few major issues. He had the North Star newspapers able to write on a daily basis, huge impact. But as soon as he saw Lincoln, he said, sitting in a chair that was way too small with his legs out, he saw every line in his face and saw the worry and kindness of the man before he even spoke. And he came out and said, Frederick Douglass, take a seat. And they talked. And what amazed him most is Lincoln listened. And then he understood the perception of the two and what they both were up against. And they understood each other, and all those preconceptions melted away. They would meet 3 more times. The last time would be on the podium for a re-election. Guess who helped Lincoln get reelected? Frederick Douglass. Guess who helped convince Lincoln that he had to let African Americans fight for their freedom? Frederick Douglass. Guess who helped them recruit? Frederick Douglass. Guess who told them also? Frederick Douglass turned around and says, now pay them the same. And when they get caught, I want them treated the same as white guys. So he wasn't going to stop until he got everything, but he understood where Lincoln's coming from. And I thought this quote would be something we can enjoy, a few of them. Actually, I think we're going to see a tape. This is actually the tape. I'll finish up with a few quotes. This is a look at the book that maybe you're all going to get. The American Civil War. Over 600,000 would die over the course of 4 years. For the United States to survive, then reunify, and become for the first time a nation free for all, they would need extraordinary leaders. 2 emerged above the rest: Abraham Lincoln, the president; Frederick Douglass, the freedom fighter. Together, they would make America a more perfect union.
America has been blessed to have the right people at the right time.
I mean, think back to those days in the Civil War where brothers literally fought blood brothers. Fathers fought their kids because they wanted the Declaration of Independence and this notion that all men were created equal to be real.
In Abraham Lincoln, you had a person with the odds stacked against him.
Bill, how can a young man born to illiterate parents in abject poverty with only 1 year of formal education emerge as one of America's perhaps best presidents who would lead us through a war and emancipate all enslaved people?
Well, he was an amazing person. I guess today we'd call him gifted. He had a vision, he had ambition.
As tough as Abraham Lincoln's first 14 years were, Frederick Douglass had it a whole lot worse. He was born a slave. He had to escape to establish his freedom, but he wasn't satisfied with that. He would want freedom for himself and freedom for all.
Once free from bondage, Douglass would relentlessly continue his self-education, be mentored by esteemed abolitionists, write a best-selling biography, start a newspaper, and be a lecturer known around the world.
As flawed as America was for the African American, he didn't want another country.
He wanted to make his stand here, almost in biblical terms. He saw the promise of America, which is hard to do when you're being beaten. So Douglass's gift was he never let the slave owners own him.
In the 1850s, as Douglass and Lincoln began to rise in stature, miles apart, America was coming apart. The North and South were diverging on the issue of slavery. The status quo would not stand, paving the way for the emergence of a new party, the Republican Party, seizing the opportunity of one-term congressman, lawyer from the Midwest, Abraham Lincoln. The rail splitter from Illinois would grab the nomination and presidency, but by the time he arrived at the White House, 7 states had left the Union. For Lincoln, secession was not an option. The war was on.
He took over a divided country. Did he actually know what he was getting into?
I don't think so, but Lincoln knew the law and he knew the Constitution backwards and forward. And so he realized after Fort Sumter happened and that a lot of the country wasn't accepting him as president, that he correctly diagnosed union, keep the country together, and then the abolition of slavery as the 2 grand causes of the Civil War.
As for Frederick Douglass, Lincoln's win was all about hope. But when he didn't immediately free the slaves and messaged appeasement in exchange for reunification, Frederick seethed.
The whole story is that progress takes patience. Douglass should have been, rightfully so, angry at the lack of progress, pushing Lincoln to move as quickly as possible. But at the same time, you have to admire and respect Lincoln's patience.
The White House looks a lot like it did back in 1860 when Abraham Lincoln was president. You could line up on that porch and hope the president would see you one-on-one. That's exactly what Frederick Douglass decided to do. He wouldn't have to wait long.
Lincoln was smitten with Douglass. He knew that he was a prophetic figure. He knew that he carried some baggage with him politically, but he wanted to meet Douglass.
After the initial meeting, a bond was formed. Lincoln released the Emancipation Proclamation. Douglass traveled the nation, recruiting blacks into the Army for the first time, the most prolific unit the 54th Massachusetts Infantry.
One of the beauties of that recruitment effort included his own two sons, who served in the 54th. I was amazed at how important the American flag was. When they were being shot at, the African American holding the flag doesn't want it to touch the soil, because it was so important to defend our flag, because it was defending our nation.
Lincoln and Douglas would meet a total of 3 times face to face, and together they would help Lincoln win re-election. Douglas would be a special guest at his inaugural. The Union would go on to win the war, free an entire race from slavery, and allow our nation to reunite. With so much work left to do, together, John Wilkes Booth's assassination robbed Frederick Douglass of a partner to do that work with, and America of its greatest president at a time of our greatest need.
Frederick Douglass would outlive Abraham Lincoln by 30 years, staying here in Rochester, New York until 1872. His major mark on American history came alongside our 16th president. Individually, they were great men. Together, they were unstoppable. That's what I thought, that you know both men, but I thought if I could get their lives to coincide, it might be something that would give us some perspective on what we're going at today. Just give you a few quotes. So the final meeting, I kind of went over this a little bit. Here comes my friend. This is the verbatim that's in Douglas's book. I'm glad to see you. I saw you in the crowd listening to my inaugural. He asked Douglas how he liked it. Said, Mr. Lincoln, I must not detain you with my poor opinion. There are thousands waiting to shake your hands. There is no man in the country whose opinion I value more. Mr. Lincoln, that was a sacred effort. Another quote I think is important. So when Lincoln finally frees all African Americans everywhere, South and North and border states, he goes, after Jefferson Davis leads his version of the White House, he wants to go to Richmond, at which time he goes aboard himself. Can you imagine that, with his son, the President of the United States? The all-black crowd greets him. And here's what his address to him is extemporaneously, and he's clearly moved by their feelings towards him, many of which are crying. He says, my poor friends, he said, you are free as air. Liberty is your birthright. God gave it to you as he gave it to others, and it is a sin that you have been deprived of it for so many years. The crowd shouted joyful approval. When Lincoln resumed speaking, they fell silent. You must try to deserve this priceless boon. Let the world see that you merit it and are able to maintain it by your good works. So think about that poignant moment. And even Lincoln, brought there by Douglas in many ways, was moved by it. He changed, he evolved too. And Douglas and his frustration. Now picture this, they got to dedicate the now controversial statue of an African American rising up out of chains with Lincoln looking down on him in Freedom Park in Washington, D.C. They don't ask Ulysses S. Grant to dedicate the statue, the sitting president. They asked Douglas, 10 years after his assassination. The money is raised by freed slaves. And this is what he said. Knowing that he was pushing and Lincoln was pausing. Had he put the abolition of slavery before the salvation of the Union, he would have alienated large numbers of people and rendered resistance to the rebellion impossible. Viewed from the abolition point of view, that's his point of view, Mr. Lincoln seemed tardy, cold, dull, and indifferent after he met him. But measuring him by the sentiment of this country and the sentiment he was bound as a statement to consult, he was swift, zealous, radical, and determined. They came together, and even after his death, he learned to understand what Lincoln was doing in leading our country. And Douglas on freedom. What a glorious day when slavery shall be no more in this country, when we have blotted out this system of wrong and made this United States in fact and in truth what it is in theory, the land of the free and the home of the brave. The words of Frederick Douglass. And that's what I wanted to capture. I don't write for the Yale professor because I couldn't get into Yale. I didn't like the campus. I write for us. The way I speak is what's in this book. The first thing I did is talk it all through with my editor, said, we got something here. I hope you feel the same way. So it's only been a few days. It's the first time I feel like I left study hall and now I have to take the oral exam. So I'd like to take some of your questions now because you do have another speaker coming up shortly, right?
Great. Thanks, Mr. Kilmeade. Absolutely. Everybody, we're so thrilled that you're here. Obviously, we can't take every question. So what I'm going to do is walk through the center aisle. We'll take about 3 or 4 questions, and then I'll come back up again and instruct you how to go and talk to Mr. Kilmeade a little bit more beyond that. So if anybody has a question right along this aisleway.
Support Brandon.
I want him to go. Let's go, Brandon. Yeah. Let's go, Brandon. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, Brian, I want to thank you for not bringing Gutfield with you.
I'm sorry, what did he say? Oh, not bringing Gutfeld?
Yeah.
Yeah, he doesn't travel well anyway. He complains a lot. Nothing's ever right for him. Yeah. Did you see that show last night? Unbelievable.
Brian, we have a question
Yes.
here.
Brian, I have 17 grandkids, ages 13 down to 2. Which of your books would be the best book to give to my grandkids?
I think the for one thing, I don't deserve any credit for it, but Scholastic knocked two of the books down from 12 to 17-year-old or 8 to 12-year-olds. Jefferson and Washington, I would get him all of them that. Some will get into it, they're not for toddlers, but I would say Washington. You know why? It's got invisible ink. It's got drop dead drops, and it's got everyday people, farmers and shopkeepers and longshoremen. So I would go with Washington. Hopefully you got their interest for the next one. Thank you.
We have another question right here from a young man.
Hello, I'm a freshman at the University of Kentucky, majoring in political science.
All right.
And there's some classes that have clear left-leaning biases in them, and I was wondering how to navigate getting a good grade in the class, but also speaking my mind.
Yeah, I have my son graduated 2 years ago, and then I got 2 daughters in college right now. But they're not. One's undecided, the other one's in education, and she took a couple of those courses. But I found, and I'm going to keep my fingers crossed, that professors, just because they might not agree with you, they'll be open to you. I would say this: don't write anything to get an A. You got to stay true to you, but be willing to back up your argument. So go deep in your argument. Rehearse it with your family and friends, and say, okay, I like George W. Bush. I like Bush 41. I love Reagan. I love Trump. Okay, why? Have 4 or 5 things to say why, and know the common arguments too. And this one, what's your first name? Noah. So Noah, go online. Read the left, read the right. I find that the people that are calm in these arguments are confident in those arguments. Don't get angry. Don't raise your voice. That's exactly what people want. See these crazy people, they don't agree with me and they lost their temper. You listen and you come back. And I find that people, it'll back up your beliefs, or you might have different ideas. Go deep into every argument. You know the common arguments. You look at these 2 bills that are about one pass, and one's probably going to pass in a couple of weeks, sadly, in some way, shape, or form. Say to yourself, how would I argue that? What's the good point? What's the bad point about it? What about the people that voted for it would have voted against it? But just saying, I'm Republican, I'm Democrat, you're wrong, you're right, will not get you an A. But I think at the University of Kentucky, I'll be naive, to get to that level, I think you have to understand you're an academic, and an academic likes to be engaged, and I think will respect you more. And I think that, didn't Ted Cruz go to Harvard? And didn't a lot of the conservatives come, what is Senator Josh Hawley went to an Ivy League school? So they tend to lead way more left than I think the University of Kentucky. But that's a good question, but don't get nervous about it. But don't be antagonistic back. I don't like this assignment. Might not be a good answer, right? But I appreciate what you're going through. But remember, think it through, never lose your temper. All right, thank you, Noah.
Any more questions around here? I tell you what, I'm going to come over to this nice gentleman who's waited, sir. I'll come right your way.
Okay. Yeah. I find like when people lose their tempers because they don't know when they start yelling, the voice starts going up, is because they're not confident in their argument.
Brian, do you know who planned the assassination of Abraham Lincoln?
Do you know who planned it?
You know who planned it.
Not personally, but John Wilkes Booth was the mastermind. You don't think so?
I think it was someone else.
Tell me.
Albert Pike.
Okay. I'm going to have to tell Bill O'Reilly, because he wrote a great book that had John Wilkes Booth.
Lincoln banished him from the United States.
But who do you think pulled the trigger?
I think Booth pulled the trigger, but the planning of it, I think, came from Canada, where he was banished to.
Interesting. I'll pursue that. I'll Google that. I would say this: they have this Derringer. I open up the special at Ford's Theater, and all I could think about is how much better our country would have been if Lincoln could have had a second and maybe third term. Because you put Grant with Lincoln, with Douglass. I believe if he lived through the 1860s, we wouldn't have needed the 1960s. Yes.
We have another question.
Hi, how are you?
And I just had a question for people that we think that we're ruining our country. The country is unrecognizable. What words or inspiration can you give us for just hope and for us to get all the things that Americans deserve and come in here legally and protect what people have built for us? We're very discouraged at this moment. We would like some encouragement from you.
Absolutely, you have it. Number one, I never saw anything as criminal as what this administration is doing with the border. And only 23% of the country approved. So what poll is he looking at that allows 1.7 million in here? In Long Island alone, we've absorbed 6,000 kids. They have not told the superintendent or the principal. They just show up at school, many of which don't even speak Spanish. They speak Portuguese. And we don't even know how to deal with it, but they put them into poorer neighborhoods. They don't put them into Beverly Hills. They don't put them into Upper East Side Manhattan because those people have too much power. Everyday working class people in undertaxed areas who mean the school's not getting the revenue. Then you go into classes already overcrowded with teachers that aren't getting paid enough. And now you have English as a second language with some kid who might not be a kid sitting next to your daughter or your son. Unbelievable, unacceptable. But I'm going to give you hope, and here's why. If you read this book and understand even our journey along the way, it always looks grim for this generation. But in the big picture, we're one great leader away from bringing us together. Not somebody just agrees with us, but sees people that don't. And that's what's going to be. I think if it comes at the top to say, you know what, AOC's way out to the left and Jim Jordan's way out to the right. I like them both. They're sincere. They're both going to have to compromise. And then if you see Joe Manchin talk over the last 2 weeks, I thought that left clues. He came out and he said, we're not even a center-left country. We're a center-right country. I can't go back to my state, even as a Democrat, and tell them I've destroyed the energy industry. I can't go back to my state and say we're $28 trillion in debt, and I would like to add not 1.7, but 3.9 trillion more. Democrat. And I go, wow, I felt the tension in the room drop. Because if a Democrat gets elected and talks like that, I feel as though we're not in bad hands. Hey, would you prefer center right as opposed to center left? Would you prefer way right? Yeah. But in a country that's built on compromise, I think things will begin to get traction again. Number one, I also believe, number two, they should be. I also believe things got to get worse before they get bad, before they get better. And things are getting so bad that we just saw the biggest backlash that I've ever seen in an off-year election, not even midterm. Those weren't just Republicans that went to the ballot box. Those were Democrats that stayed away or voted the other way. Do you know there were 5 city council members that changed hand seats in New York City? Do you know there were 10 in New Jersey? Do you know that I think the Virginia legislature flipped on Long Island? We had one congressman, it was Peter King. Now the whole thing is flooded with Republicans, not because we want red, that's where I live, it's because they don't want that. And they don't feel like the politicians are speaking to them. So we're already correcting. But the thing is, everybody would want to be in our shoes. Everybody. Our economy is beginning to ramp up again. Innovation is coming back again. I think that people are going to see these 10 million jobs open. We'll cut it cut in half with the right inspiration. I would love to see a president get behind the microphone and say, hey, America, got to get back to work. Off the beach. Stop counting my inflated dollars that I printed up yesterday. And you got to get back to work. There's glory in work. The people that the first generation know it, they come here, they can't believe the job they have, just an opportunity to make a living. And I think that's got to come from the top. And I think things have gotten so bad so quick that I think we're going to do what we do best, course correct. Yeah.
We have time for one more question.
Okay.
Okay. And I see a nice man over here that I'm going to try to get to. Hold on.
By the way, this is so flattering to see you guys here on a beautiful Saturday where I think everyone together has to mow the lawn here. Is there any place that's not grass, full of grass? As a state, you rally around, but you got to use electric mowers. Please, got to save the environment. I know, I'm kidding. But this is so flattering. Don't think I'm taking this for granted. To see everyone come here like this, my first visit ever to Kentucky, by the way. So, and I think I might send for my stuff and stay, all right?
Brian, what leaders do you see on both sides of the aisle that can help bring our country together,
Okay.
which seems so needed at this time in history?
Thanks for the question. Okay, on the left, I love Harold Ford. And if you watch him, he's a great person. Yeah, he's center left. So what? He bleeds red, white, and blue. Joe Manchin's not going to run for president, but I like that attitude. I really do. I think the Democrats got to do some recruiting because there is not even. I mean, AOC will win Queens if there's a president of Queens, but Queens does not represent America. But she is their biggest star. Nancy Pelosi is a day from retiring. So where are their leaders? Good luck with that. But on the other side, you have Ron DeSantis, Mike Pompeo. You have Nikki Haley. You got Condoleezza Rice. You have Kristi Noem. Who else could I see running? You have Senator Josh Hawley. Ted Cruz is going to run again. And the ones that everybody I mentioned is not running if Trump's in. So if Trump comes in, that'll be it. So I think that he's maneuvering that way. I just think when you talk about next generation, to answer your question, sir, that's like 7 or 8. That's just off the top of my head. I think there's a lot of people that came out of the Trump administration that have so much promise. And I think Mike Pence did a great job. I think he's a fine person, one of the finest people I will ever meet. And I think that he would get our country in the right direction. And he does. It's very hard to hate Mike Pence. Yeah. No, he's a great person. So I'm just saying, you have a lot of talent in their 40s and 50s. In Josh Hawley's case, his 30s. Where on the left, I think the reason why Joe Biden is even president right now is because Bernie Sanders could not get elected. One is 80 and one's about to turn 78. So their next generation's got to show themselves, but their next generation's represented by 93 people in the House, and that's the Progressive Caucus. And that does not, and we just found out that doesn't represent the country. So listen, I know I'm talking, I could do this for another 3 hours, and I usually do every day. I appreciate you watching Fox and Friends. The radio show is briankilmeadshow.com. And please watch Sunday night, because if Sunday night rates high, I could do more history specials. So I'll have a good argument. And if Kentucky shows up, that'll be great. And the President Freedom Fighter has a chance.
For Brian Kilmeade.
Thank you very much. Thank you.